My guest today is Michael Johnston, who's the Associate Dean Academic of Education, School of Education at Victoria University. And I think you got your PhD in academic psychology, right?
In cognitive psychology, yeah. It was something very different to what I do these days. It was in how human beings recognize three-dimensional objects under rotation. So if you think about any three-dimensional object, what's kind of interesting is that you can recognize it from a point of view that you've never seen it from before. And so somehow your brain is able to recognize an object reconstructed from two-dimensional projections onto your retinae, the light receptive surfaces at the backs of your eyes, and then that gets relayed to your visual cortex at the back of your brain, and somehow the brain reconstructs a three-dimensional image. And not only that, it can recognize an object from a novel point of view. And so my PhD was really about how that works in information processing terms.
So that's interesting, actually, because I remember when I was at school, they made us do this sort of battery of tests, which were meant to predict, what you end up doing. And even though I was doing pretty well at school, they did that test on me, and they basically said, okay, you're useless, because I did really badly on this one section, which was about taking three-dimensional shapes and rotating them in your head.
Oh, yes, right, yeah.
So is that a sort of known part of testing, like intelligence tests or tests for, because that was actually a test for careers, but I'm sure they were integrating some.
I think it's extremely odd that it's a test for a career, unless it's a very specialized one that involves mental imagery or the ability to visualize things like that. But it is, interestingly, an experimental approach that's used in that area, or was used when I was working in that area. I didn't actually like that that experimental approach. What would tend to happen with that experimental approach is that somebody would be presented on a computer screen with an image, and then perhaps another image alongside it, or in a subsequent frame, and they had to say whether it was the same object or not, and that would involve perhaps rotating the object in their head to see if it matched up. And my problem with that is that there's no guarantee that kind of task gets at a long-term representation of the object. It's just something you're seeing now, which is very different than, or potentially very different than, how you access a stored representation of the object. So my approach was more to have people learn to recognize one view of a novel object that I constructed using three-dimensional computer graphics, just kind of meaningless shapes, and then to present later the same objects, different objects, rotated around, and people had to respond using buttons to indicate whether it was an object that they'd learned or a new one. So that way I could be reasonably confident that they were actually accessing something that had been stored for some length of time.
Okay, that's interesting, because I think the tests that I did, as far as I can remember it, because it was a long time ago now, was looking at novel objects. It wasn't just sort of presenting me with a ladder or something that you'd see in reality, or, I don't know, trying to think of a complex object, like a funny shaped chair or something.
Well, typically with those tasks, if they're presented in a sort of intelligence testing context, they're kind of little block constructions that, I don't know if they were like that, but quite often they're just kind of Lego block type arrangements. And
yeah, that's right. I think they look like sort of computer generated polygons.
Yeah.
But so can you say a bit about what were the sort of research goals of looking into that? I mean, it's interesting in its own right, but I mean, does it connect to other things?
Well, I was actually working in a computer vision laboratory, so I was one of two psychologists. Everybody else was a computer nerd, and we were supposedly contributing sort of human factors understandings to these people who were trying to make robots that could see. I mean, that was 30 years ago now, and at the time, computer graphics, computer vision, all of that was very rudimentary. It's come a long way since then, and gone in directions that I've lost track of. But so that was sort of supposedly one practical import of doing this. But one of the things that I realised at that time actually was that the whole notion of artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer, in the sense that if we're talking about intelligence, like humans have intelligence, or even maybe animals have intelligence, there's a fundamental difference with the sort of intelligence that computers have, which is that obviously human beings and other animals have evolved to be adapted to their environments, and so their intelligence is about navigating in an environment from which they need to extract things that they need to stay alive. That's the whole driver for evolution. Whereas a computer has no such drivers, so it has nothing to motivate its intelligence, as it were. So it's always going to be, in my opinion, a fundamentally different kind of intelligence to the kind of intelligence that humans have, which is why I worry a lot less than some people about the machines taking over. I know some very, very intelligent and people who have done a lot of thinking about these kinds of things are very scared that artificial intelligence will lead to a kind of dystopia, whether it's like Terminator or whatever, that the computers will gain too much power and perhaps take over. But I don't worry so much about that, because I can't see computers having any motivation to take over. I can see artificial intelligence being used nefariously by human beings, that's for sure, but I don't worry about computers becoming self-determining dictators or something.
Right. Do you know the old arguments of a New Zealand hero, Samuel Butler?
No.
You know this author? He wrote Erewhon and Way of All Flesh.
I know of him, but I don't know the argument.
Well, okay. Well, so Erewhon is sort of obviously set in New Zealand, but he doesn't say as much. But he lived he wrote another book called, I think, A Year in the Canterbury Settlement. So he came from England, and he was in Christchurch with a sheep farm, I think. Anyway, at the beginning of this novel, this traveler sort of goes to this distant island, and he goes over these white mountains, which are obviously the Southern Alps, and he finds this sort of long-lost civilization, which is Erewhon, which is nowhere backwards. And the people there have smashed all the mechanical objects, all the machines, basically. So he finds smashed watches and stuff like that. And Butler had a lot of theory behind this as well. I think he wrote essays on the subject as well. His theory was he was writing, I guess, Erewhon, was that even in the 1880s? Anyway, end of the 19th century, I'm pretty sure. And he'd read a lot of Darwin. And his intuition was just like, if you have the basic conditions of Darwinian evolution, natural selection, then it'll work with whatever is to hand. It doesn't have to be a biological organism. It can be sort of based on chips, whatever. I mean, he didn't know about chips, but so what he was getting at, I think, was like, as long as you have replication and you have variability, what we would call mutation, or what manifests itself as mutation when you're talking about genetics, then you can actually generate the motivation to survive, right? Because the reason the biological organisms want to survive is probably just because that trait has been selected for. Because if we didn't have the desire to survive, it would be less likely that we would be here, right? So is that kind of scenario possible, that just because these machines are around?
I guess what would be the adaptive pressures on computers is what you'd have to ask. How would that come about, and how would it affect their reproductive mechanism? So that it's plausible as an idea, but you'd need to explain those things, because at the moment they're all constructed by us, and they can be dismantled by us, and then we might design a better one, but that's not the same thing as an adaptive pressure for them to self-replicate, which they by and large don't yet. We could even build machines that do self-replicate, and they could be programmed to produce better and better and more efficient designs and so on. Not quite the same thing as natural selection. I mean, one of the important things about natural selection, I completely agree that it needn't be biological. You may be aware of Richard Dawkins' original conception of the idea of a meme, which is a kind of information unit that of which there are many, which are produced by us because we have these ideas, and then they're culled in that some of them are not successful or not. They don't satisfy our need to express ourselves in certain ways, but others do, and they then grow and replicate and mutate and so on. So that's just information. So absolutely, it needn't be biological, but I can't see at the moment how we would have a scenario where machines were both self-replicating. I mean, that part's possible, but what would be the adaptive pressure for them to change?
Well, I don't know really. I'm just sort of thinking out loud because I found Butler's ideas interesting. But I suppose, I mean, if you think back to the sort of, well, we assume, I guess, or we think, there was some kind of primordial soup back in the day, right? That's how it all started, maybe.
Yeah.
So what you have there is just kind of, okay, at some point you get single-celled organisms. I think that's still the story, right?
Yeah.
So they're just sort of sitting there hanging out in their primordial soup. And, you know, if you compare, it's very easy if you go to, say, a random island and look at the flora and fauna to see that they're competing. So there's a survival of the fittest type thing going on there, dynamic going on there. But the primordial soup situation is really just that they're sitting there or floating there, and the ones that survive, and the ones that don't. So there's already your selective pressure, right?
Yeah, that's true. But you know, I think there's another thing that you have to bring into the evolutionary picture apart from self-replication and what was the other thing you mentioned that he came up with?
Oh yeah, variability actually.
Variability is important. That's right. There's got to be a mutative mechanism so that there's some difference, and you know, probably an element of randomness in that is important as well. But I'd say a third thing is what you just mentioned or implied, which is a competition for scarce resources. Right. The reason the pressure that comes about on those islands for things to mutate, well, not to mutate, but for certain mutations to be more successful than others, is that they're competing for stuff, and there's a limited amount of stuff. So again, you know, you can imagine, I guess, a contrived situation in which machines are doing that you've got a limited number of PowerPoints and they've got to bash each other up for access to the PowerPoints. You could definitely, you know, contrive that situation, but it's hard for me to see how we're heading in a direction where machines are going to compete for scarce resources such that and mutate such that they, you know, evolve in the kind of way that we did and animals do. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they will, but it's not obvious to me that that's true.
Yeah, it's also to do with these sort of starting conditions, isn't it? Because I also remember Matthew Arnold, who was a great sort of English classicist and humanist of the 19th century. I think this is anecdotal or apocryphal, but he was said to have remarked when somebody told him about Darwin's theory of evolution, "Oh, that's all in Lucretius," right? The Roman poet, and in Lucretius and in some of the earlier Greek philosophers, you find this idea that the earth just sort of gave birth to beings. They just emerged, and then some of them died out. So you sort of have the idea of selection-ish, but you did by selective pressures, but you don't have a mechanism for reproduction.
Right.
There's just and there's no reason really why the Earth is bringing forth these shapes and beasts, right? So you sort of get a bit of Darwin, but you don't have the full story. And actually, I mean, Darwin himself didn't have the full story in terms of genetics.
That's right.
But he intuited that there was.
And neither did he really start the whole conversation about evolution. I mean, he was certainly very, very influential, but you know, there was Lamarck before him and others who had started to have those ideas that life changed over time, and it wasn't the case that every species that we have now has always been just as it is now, you know, created by God in 7 days or whatever.
Yeah, there are non-Darwinian evolutionary theories and non-Charles Darwinian evolutionary theories like Erasmus Darwin as well.
Right.
But
yeah. But you know, if you take that that kind of intellectual line, Darwin having the theory of natural selection, and then Mendel a couple of decades later, I think, growing his peas in the monastery and discovering the idea of genetics in theory. But even he, of course, didn't have the mechanism. So it was another theoretical step, because he saw that there must be something like DNA going on. But then it was another 80 years or so until Watson and Crick found the actual biochemical mechanism for genetics. It's very interesting how that happens in science, how over time ideas coalesce into something that's sort of more and more specific. And sometimes those ideas are had very much in the abstract long before we understand their mechanisms.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, it's interesting you mentioned the memes, partly because I think Dawkins was wanting to play on the Greek word, Greek words for memory,
right,
as well as other things. And I think it was meant to be a kind of half rhyme for gene.
Gene, yeah.
But anyway, I think he says in I don't remember, is this The Selfish Gene, or maybe it's another book? He says, "I hope my classicist friends will forgive me for not, it's not completely accurate in terms of the Greek derivation, but that's okay." But I read this paper recently by Alan Davidson at Sydney, and he's talking about the evolution of bad ideas and how they spread. And actually, if you take the meme metaphor, the meme idea, the way that you imagine ideas and fashion spreading is slightly, I wouldn't say it's completely antithetical, but it's sort of tangential to the way in which you might think ideas should spread in a kind of rational way in terms of falsifying hypotheses.
Yeah.
So one of the points he makes is that it can be an evolutionary virtue for a meme to be unfalsifiable, right? Because if you put yourself out there, if you're an organism and you put yourself out there for falsifiability, which is sort of death, then you are not likely to survive. And so if you're an idea and you just say on the face of yourself, hey, look, you can test this, you can test me in this way, and if you test me in this way, I won't survive, then you're unlikely to spread through the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have an idea that sort of says, I'm so obscure that you can't even tell what I'm saying, and even if you could tell what I was saying, you couldn't develop a test that would actually rule me out. Yeah. Those ideas can spread very quickly.
Exactly. And when you're talking about evolutionary mechanisms in general, you have this problem because we have some conception of what we would see as desirable or, in this case, a good idea. But that might have nothing to do with the mechanisms that make it successful. The same is true of organisms. Nobody thinks that, or very few people would think that COVID-19 is a nice organism to have round. But, it evolved in response to certain adaptive pressures and then, managed to do this species jump from the pangolin or whatever it was that it came from. And likewise, ideas can be... So it's interesting to explore what are the pressures on ideas, and certainly transmissibility is one of them, and you can see why, at least in the immediate or short term, a lack of falsifiability would be to the advantage of an idea. I'm not so sure about the longer term, in the sense that, the concept of falsifiability is itself a meme. It's been pretty successful since it was conceived of and, made explicit by Popper, but, it had been floating around as a thing in science before that to an extent. And, one could argue that it added to the power of science in a way that made cultures that used scientific paradigm stronger and more successful. And that is recognised at some level and then is transmitted through our education systems in our science education as a good approach to testing ideas. And so there are other pressures that maybe in the longer term might mean that what we would see as good ideas, as in ideas that are productive of approximating truth over time, are also more successful. So short-term success is not the same as long-term success.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although, I am worried just at the moment, though, because, it seems like there are these sort of free-floating memes, and then these kind of long-term effects can kick in, and hopefully the sort of best ideas will win out. And that's always been the sort of liberal assumption that they will. But there's this other thing, which is sort of human nature, the way that we've evolved, and it seems to encode certain tendencies in us. And one of them is rationality, like we can reason about things. But it seems like there are also lots of strong tendencies towards, in-group loyalty and things like that, and revenge, and things that we evolved precisely because we're not computers, that we're human beings, we want to survive. And also, most of the time that we were evolving, we were in sort of scrublands of
Savannas
Africa,
and so on.
right?
Yeah.
So it's different to sort of industrial society.
That's a key point, because what we've actually done is create an environment for ourselves that we're maladapted to, in the sense that, as you said, we evolved to live in savannas in smallish social groups, nomadically and so on. And then in a very short space of time, from the perspective of evolution, as in far too short for us to evolve to adapt to a new environment, we've created environments that are quite different to that, where we're densely populated in cities with very different social arrangements, with much more complex technology to negotiate. And also now we've got to the point where the environment changes so rapidly through technological development that even within a single lifetime we experience change in a way that none of our ancestors would have, and which we're almost certainly not adapted or evolved to deal with very well. And maybe this has got something to do with the apparent increase in mental health issues, anxiety disorders in particular.
Right. Yeah, I'm also interested in another Dawkins idea, which is the extended phenotype. This idea that there are certain things which look cultural, which you can actually view in terms of just an expression of genes. So I think Dawkins' key example is the beaver dam, a very Canadian example. I don't think he intended it that way, but beavers naturally build dams. You put them in different places. Well, you put them in places with the right conditions. They probably don't build dams if you put them in the Sahara, but like if you put them in a nice Canadian river or any kind of wetland with some wood around, they will start building beaver dams. And I suppose you could look at humans in the same way, and I think actually, in a sense, Aristotle did this. I mean, Aristotle says famously, man is as doon politikon, a political being, a political animal. The word politikon also comes from the word polis. So in a sense, what he's really saying is humans, anthropos is actually the words humans rather than males. They naturally build polis, they naturally build city-states. So the claim seems to be something like humans are naturally sociable. I mean, it's more generous to take it that way, because I think if you asked Aristotle, because he was a Greek or Macedonian Greek, he would have actually thought that it was the polis, it was this sort of specifically Greek social form of the city-state that was like a natural expression of mankind.
Well, he probably didn't think historically in the way that we might. So.
Well, I mean, Aristotle is an example of someone who I think has ethnic prejudices of a certain type. The obvious counterexample is, well, what about, the Persians or something? They don't have polis in the same way. They do have cities, they just don't have Greek-style city-states. And I think there's good evidence that his conclusion would have been something like, well, they're less human.
They're not anthropos.
Exactly, or they're sort of deficient in some way.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is the conclusion we want. But
no, but
you can see what he's saying, though. We have some tendencies.
We have a tendency to live together in society. But certainly our technological development has morphed, one could say, maybe twisted that out of shape, in the sense that we now live in, maybe even, in Aristotle's time in Athens, people already were living in a way that they weren't really adapted to, that they were more densely populated, they were not nomadic anymore. And now, some cities people live in pretty small boxes stacked on top of one another in huge apartment buildings. The social dynamics are utterly different. And so while I think I think that idea of the extended phenotype is very valuable, what gets built on top of what is biological is cultural, and that gives us a new departure point in terms of ways in which we can change our environment and create new pressures on ourselves. But biologically, we're not equipped to adapt and evolve that quickly. So how that plays out, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. That's
another one is
issue.
war, right? We're probably, it's something we probably naturally have always done. It's certainly something other primates do, other animals do. They fight one another, but not necessarily lethally. I believe even, you can correct me on this, but even in the classical Hellenic times, battles were not always that lethal. The city-states would go out and have a battle because that's what you did. To an extent, you had to display your arete or your manly virtues. And am I right? This was part of their modus operandi.
This is controversial actually, because there's this historian and classicist, Victor Davis Hanson, which you may have heard of. He's become a pundit, a conservative pundit in the States as well. But he started out as an expert in Greek warfare, and he's written a lot of very interesting books and articles about hoplite warfare, the clash of heavily armed Greek infantrymen, and they clash in these sort of groups called phalanxes, which are sort of like, people say they're sort of like scrums. They're rather large scrums where people have spears and they're trying to stab each other. Yeah. But one of the things Victor Davis Hanson says is precisely that this is a way of getting a clear result in a conflict. You go into the field with your guys and the other city's guys, and they are all guys, and you clash, and whoever sort of wins the scrum. At some point, there's a pushing. We have references to this in the Greek text, that they actually do push against each other in lots of cases. The other side sort of collapses and flees, and at that point it's just over. And maybe not that many people die.
The victors don't necessarily chase them and hack them down as they flee, or
what you usually would do is chase them off the battlefield, and then you put up a trophy, tropaion, which is
all their shields and stuff. And
was usually one suit of armor, and you dedicate it to a god.
Yeah.
But it's controversial because other scholars say actually the realities of Greek warfare are a little more complicated than that, and you do get a lot more skirmishing, and you get people. You get some cases where warriors will pursue each other into woods, and things like that.
But even so, what you've described is still there's a ritual form to it. Sometimes maybe that ritual form is violated, or people go too far, or they do something that they're not really supposed to. But it sounds to me similar in a sense to the way a lot of animal conflict works. I'm not talking about predators and prey, but say two male lions fighting for dominance, or two male chimps or whatever. They'll have a battle, and one of them might get quite injured, but typically they won't go to the point of killing one another, and the victor will then be recognized as the dominant one, and things will carry on. Whereas the way war has gone for humans now, if you probably culminated in World War II, where upwards of 70 million people were killed, a very large proportion of them civilians, and it had nothing to do anymore with just, it wasn't ritual in form, it was total war. The idea was to wipe out your opponents, completely bomb entire cities, whether it was firebombing of Dresden or the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima.
Yeah, and there's a case of the sort of atavistic bits of human nature coming to the fore, because of course there's that famous video of, I think it's Himmler, maybe Goering, speaking to the crowd of civilians or German citizens, and he says, "Do you want total war?" To which I think most of us nowadays would say, "Not really."
No, thank you.
And they all go, "Yeah." But of course, it's not like the Allies were innocent of this kind of thing too, in terms of bombing raids.
No, it was an ideological battle at one level, but then it played out in this, performance of violence, the like of which the world has never seen before.
Yeah, I think I'm already talking about lots of things that I don't know much about, but I might as well continue. So
yeah.
I think that the action in terms of finding something that approaches purely ritualistic combat is probably in Mesoamerica, or definitely with the Aztecs, possibly with the Inca, because I just know from very amateur interest in this kind of thing, that this is a story that's often told, that pre-European colonization, the warfare such that it was, and there was warfare, and there was, you know, a culture of warriors and things like that, but the warfare such that it was sort of focused on capturing your opponent, and then of course there was enslavement and there was human sacrifice.
Yeah.
So it wasn't
all nice.
It wasn't completely, you know, non-violent, but
no, it's more about domination than
yes,
killing.
Yes, that's right. That's the idea. I'm always very skeptical. I don't know what it is. I think it's just the idea that people are trying to say, "Oh, look, everyone was playing nicey-nicey," and I think a kind of rule of thumb as a historian for me is often that the past was quite nasty. I mean, it's a rule of thumb that comes from reading the texts and you know, being aware that these societies are usually, past societies are usually much more violent than ours.
Yep.
So I'm a bit skeptical, but it may be true.
Well, I think it's actually, you know, human beings to me are pretty much human beings. They have different cultures and so on, but what makes a difference is technology. So I think that explains both why war now is much more lethal and horrible, and also why our society has become less violent. Because if you've got lethal weaponry, you can't afford to be violent with it, or your society will be ripped apart, right? You know, if everyone's carrying a gun, as they do in some American states, you've got a serious incentive to behave peacefully, or things get seriously nasty, and they do.
Well, they do.
They do sometimes
the
get
States,
seriously nasty. That's true. But at the same time, you know, you may see an incident of violence that occurs is worse, but there are probably fewer incidents of violence because there's a serious disincentive to escalating things too much.
I don't know how much that works in the States, just because they do seem to have rates of homicide that are much higher.
But I guess, you know, the kind of par excellence example would be the nuclear deterrent.
Yeah. No,
nobody wants a war when it will, and you know, mutually assured destruction is on the table.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where we can say, so far, the nuclear deterrent has been
hell of a
associated.
risky strategy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not morally defending it. What I'm saying is that I think that technology probably makes the big difference between whether, you know, war can be ritualistic and whether it's just out and out lethal.
No. I mean, I don't disagree about the nuclear deterrent. I mean, it is striking that after the first two times the bomb was used in anger in Japan, it hasn't been used again, and it's actually very interesting because it's not like there was an absence of motive. I mean, obviously, the Cold War was a time of great ideological conflict as well.
Yep.
And
probably without nuclear weapons, it would have descended into a conventional conflict at some point.
Well, and there were temptations. I mean, I think MacArthur at some point wanted to use nukes against the Chinese, right, during the Korean War. I think that's true. But anyway, so we've come to the edge various times, but it hasn't happened. And I think you're right. It's basically because the consequences would have been so dire. And there's even that story that surfaced recently, bit of a pun there, because I think it was a Russian submarine commander. I think this is accurate, that he was actually ordered at some point to fire the nuclear payload, and he didn't. And I think it was a glitch in the system. Right. So you hear various rumors. I can't remember the exact details. You hear various rumors of this kind of thing, and it's interesting because, if you're a soldier and you're commanding officer, or you get messages telling you to shoot, to fire at your opponent, you'll probably do it. Even though actually there's a whole separate controversy about how often soldiers will shoot their weapons, right?
And anyway, when they do, would they actually take aim or just fire them randomly?
Yeah. But assuming that they do, I mean, well, let's just put it this way: that like shooting your gun is a less serious thing than starting a nuclear exchange, a full-blooded nuclear exchange, right? And most people know that, which actually kind of makes me feel optimistic in a sense. But yeah, and I know that certain policy specialists say, because there's a lot of effort nowadays and for the past few decades to stop certain states getting nuclear weapons, because it seems obvious that like the fewer nuclear weapons the better. But I know certain policy experts will argue that if you look at the record of nuclear states, having a nuclear weapon often makes you more conservative in the way you go about things.
Right.
Doesn't seem to have worked so well in the case of the States or in Russia, actually.
Yeah, it might depend on other political factors. I'm not so sure about that either. And it might depend how how hegemonic you can be by other means. It might depend on the relative size of your stockpile. I mean, I would say Kim Jong-un has a serious disincentive to using nuclear weapons first, because his country would be annihilated, and he would be annihilated if he did. Whereas one could conceive of a scenario whereby one of his enemies with a much larger stockpile saw it as a potentially good idea just to take him out. I don't know.
So anyway, I mean, I think a lot of these questions are going back to the idea that there is a human nature, and there are aspects of it which could lead to our destruction, and are at least sort of not ideally designed for the societies that we have now.
Because our biological adaptation has become out of kilter with our technological progress.
Yes, of course. Another way of putting it is that we haven't done the best job yet of designing our institutions so that they take into account our human nature, and they harness our human nature in a way which sort of, doesn't allow it to release all its sort of negative potential, but actually allows the positive aspects of it to sort of power progress and the kind of things we want to see in a society. So one of the questions, I guess, is just, you have this hard wiring, you have this sort of hard drive of human nature, then you have this sort of extended phenotype stuff, which I guess is kind of like the software package that you just got with your computer.
Yeah.
And then you have this ability to bring in new software, and that's culture, right? And that's science as well. So you can actually, to a certain extent, you can get the software, except that the software, we're not at the stage, it's going to get really interesting when we get to the stage where the software can start toying with the hardware, right? Which really, we actually go into the genetic code, and that brings up a whole host of moral issues and very
probably a seriously bad idea, not just for moral reasons, but because what you're doing then is interfering in a top-down way with a mechanism that works very well in a bottom-up way. So anything that evolves does so by a huge number of very small changes and adaptive pressures to select the best ones. Whereas if you start thinking that you can engineer a better solution, then you're seriously messing up that whole bottom-up process. And I think that's when unintended consequences become not just likely but inevitable. And I think the cultural institutions are subject to the same forces. Again, you can see a cultural institution as something that evolves over time in response to social pressures, and where it happens in a sort of slow and gradual way, you might end up with more robust and well-adapted institutions than when it happens by revolution, for example.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess a lot of the utopian schemes that we've seen in the past have been attempts to kind of override the things that people didn't like in human nature. So I think that route is probably not the best one, where you just say, well, people disagree and that leads to strife, and there are sort of sexual selection pressures, people compete for mates and things like that, so let's stop all that. So I think, the kind of utopias that are presented in, say, Plato's Republic, where you have a community of wives and things like that, that seems to be an attempt just to say, okay, we're going to just redesign human society based on, I think for Plato it was ultimately based on this view of metaphysics and ethics, which is that we can just figure out what the good is, and then we can apply that back down to the way humans are. So I think Aristotle was at least wiser in that he had a conception of the hardware that was there that you just sort of couldn't mess with. You had to take into account. But anyway, it's funny we got all into this. It's very interesting. But I guess I was only at the first bit of your career. But it's interesting you're talking about the three-dimensional objects. So just one more thing on this, because we've already gotten, I suppose, a bit controversial, but just to continue along that line. So I half remember that when people go into things like sex differences in cognitive functions, which is a hugely controversial subject, but it's basically there aren't differences, right? The IQ, to the extent that it's meaningful, is equal on average,
More or less, yeah.
more or less. But I seem to recall that for some reason, rotating three-dimensional objects is one of the only things. Are men meant to be better at that, or women?
Yeah, so there are a few things that...
And verbal ability,
you're right,
women are meant to be better
when you
at.
put it all together, at the average, men and women don't really differ. There's an hypothesis that men have more variability, so they're overrepresented at the top and the bottom of the distribution. And that I'd say that idea is debatable, but there's some evidence for it. Some interesting evidence for it in the New Zealand education system, actually, that we can come back to. But just to complete what you're asking here, in some spatial tasks, men seem to have an on average advantage. Of course, it's always important to bear in mind that the distributions of men and women in any mental capacity overlap very greatly. So you're talking about smallish differences at the mean, where there's massive overlap. So there will always be, women who are better than most men at mental rotation, and men who have stronger verbal ability than women, because that's the female advantage is apparently in certain verbal tasks. Women will do a bit better than men on average, but when you put it all together, you do tend to get a picture where there's very little difference at the mean.
Right. So I mean, even though I'm male, I sucked at those three-dimensional, the manipulating the three-dimensional shape questions in the test I was given. So
yeah.
But I did want to get back to the New Zealand education system, actually, because so after you did your PhD, did you do postdoctoral work as well?
Yeah, I worked at La Trobe University in Melbourne for a few years. I was working more on literacy-related things then, so I started to get into the educational field at that point. I was actually studying dyslexia and the reasons why people become or are dyslexic, as in they have problems learning to read, even though there are no other apparent intellectual indicators that they ought to. So people who have perfectly good oral language skills and sort of general intelligence, and yet a profound problem learning to read.
Right, so that's what I was always told. I mean, definitely when I was at elementary school in Canada, that was what the perception, that people can be highly intelligent, but just they can't do writing for some...
It's quite rare.
They struggle.
It's actually quite rare. Most problems learning to read or learning to write are attributable to problems with teaching them.
Right.
They haven't been taught in the right way.
Okay.
I think that's a massive issue in our education system, not just in New Zealand, but around the Western world at least, that we've, for some reason, adopted methods of teaching literacy that aren't very effective. And
so it sounds like you do have a view, but I'm interested because my mother was a kindergarten teacher for many years and head of a kindergarten, and there was a whole phonics debate, right?
Yeah.
So do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to teach phonics rigorously. That's not to say that doing that alone is going to be enough for somebody to become a fluent reader, but it's a sine qua non. It's important in an alphabetic language. I mean, if you in English, if you've got a command of phonics, then you can decode about 70% of written words. In German, it's close to 100%.
Because certain languages are
much more regular. German
in terms of how they're pronounced.
English.
Yeah. So Spanish is probably something like 100%, right? Because if you know the rules for the pronunciation of certain letters, you can speak any of the words.
And so that's
French is almost as bad as English. I assume.
An enormous advantage of having an alphabetic language.
That's right. And so this is another thing that I tell the students, because after the Bronze Age collapsed, after the Greek Dark Age, they have to reinvent writing basically because they lose linear B and whatever linear A was. Linear B seems to be a syllabary with I think some other elements I don't know at all. But the new Greek alphabet as it emerges and is the one we kind of know and love and it's still being used in Greece today, that is a true alphabet. And not only that, it has distinction between some long and short vowels. And one story you can tell about that, like Barry Powell a scholar, has is that they just wanted to encode their great poetry, the Homeric poems, which were around at the time, and some of the other early poems. Their meter depends on the alternation of long and short vowels, so that's why they do it. But it does seem to mean that, especially if you're a foreigner, if you're living in a kind of multicultural world like the Eastern Mediterranean, then even if you're not someone who grows up speaking Greek, if you learn the rules for how to pronounce it, you can pronounce the words. And that's different to, syllabaries where you have to fill in the vowels.
Yep.
And it's very different, obviously, to systems like Chinese.
Which are ideographic. Yeah.
Yeah. Which have their advantages, though, because, of course, you speak different Chinese dialects, you can still read something written in Chinese. So that does have its pros, but the cons are that you've got to learn all these characters.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, going back to New Zealand education system. So one of the things I saw you'd written about, which interests me, again, going back to school days, because I was at an all-boys school.
Yeah.
And there's another debate that I heard my parents having at the dinner table. Is it better for boys? And my dad always had this theory that boys do better in all-boys schools. And his theory of the mechanism was because they don't have any girls to show off for. The assumption being that boys will show off for girls in a kind of non-productive way, not by being nerds, but by being kind of rebels. So I know you worked a bit on boys' schools.
Yeah, so I can definitely tell you about the evidence that boys do better in boys' schools in academic performance. So I've done some work where I've looked at all of the NCEA data and compared boys in boys' schools with boys in co-ed schools. And I've done it for girls as well a while ago for girls, but I found the same thing for both. In single-sex schools, boys and girls do better than they do in co-ed schools after you control for things like the decile of the school, so how socioeconomically well off the students are. And one of the interesting things about, or kind of helpful things about NCEA data is that it can be disaggregated down to very small units of assessment, and we can compare internal assessment and external assessment. And actually, you also find that in boys' schools, there's a more rigorous approach to assessment. They're more likely to do assessments that involve time-limited exams, for example. I'm not, by the way, saying that I think that time-limited exams are a brilliant method of assessment. I think they're often not. But what is clear from the NCEA data is that they're harder to do well in than internal assessments are. And yet boys' schools have a higher emphasis on exams, and they still get higher results overall than boys from who are in co-ed schools.
But you say that all girls schools, so girls do better in all girls schools as well.
Yes.
Okay, so the results that you found there, are they things that have been replicated internationally? I mean, is what you just said, that's based on New Zealand data. It's not a sort of overall picture of the research that's been done on this question internationally?
Yeah, there has been international research, and it's not always consistent. I think there is a general trend for boys to do better in boys' schools. I don't know what the international literature says about girls and girls' schools, but I think it's probably similar. But as to the theory of why, I can't really answer that. My intuition is that it has something to do with the school culture. That single-sex schools are more likely to have a certain esprit de corps, if you know what I mean, a kind of sense of pride in the school and upholding a kind of traditional view of education and the school culture. It may have something to do with it. It may have also to do with something like your dad's theory, but whether it's boys showing off for girls or actually just that when they're when the sexes are segregated, they're more likely just to compete amongst themselves to do well rather than compete with each other for the attention of the opposite sex or something. I don't know. These are all just speculations. I can't answer it because I don't have the evidence.
Yeah. But it is interesting. I mean, because your first theory is almost a kind of compound, right? It's sort of saying that, if I understood you correctly, it's almost just that there's a correlation between single-sex schools and traditional educational, more traditional schools, basically, traditional educational practices.
Yeah.
Because the thing, I mean, it's interesting to me that you did this in New Zealand, partly because in England, where I went to school, my sense is, I may be getting this wrong, my impression as someone who lived there was that all boys' schools are overwhelmingly private schools. Single-sex schools, I think, are overwhelmingly private schools. Not uniquely. There are all-girls grammar schools, but again, grammar schools are not comprehensives, right? Comprehensives are non-selective. And I'm pretty sure most comprehensives are, in Britain, mixed, coeducational. So, of course, then there's all these confounds, in the UK, because you can say, oh, look, all the boys' schools are doing really well. All the all-girls schools are doing really well. That's partly because they're private schools, and then you have all these things like middle-class parents and more resources, and you have to control for all that. So, but in New Zealand, it's very striking that when you come here, the school scene, to the extent that you're kind of exposed to it just through seeing kids walk by in the street and stuff, it looks very British. Like the uniforms they wear look very, very British. And the idea of having single-sex state schools is very interesting. So it looks British, but it's like much more...
private education is not a big thing in New Zealand, although there are public schools that, as you say, tend to want to behave like private schools or have that kind of culture. But in that research that I did, I actually found some of the largest single-sex advantages for low decile schools and for Māori and Pacifica kids.
So they get a boost just from being single-sex, as far as you can tell.
There's something about being in a single-sex environment that seems to help. And, I think it was in every analysis that I did. There was no exception at any level or for any ethnic group or for any decile echelon. But some of the biggest advantages were at the lower decile end. And that, I think that's very interesting, because it's not just this sort of elitist thing then. It's not just, single-sex schools trying to emulate private schools or something like that. Right. What it is, I think it's something we should be doing a lot of research on, because, boys are not doing well in our education system at the moment. And here we actually will go back a little bit to what I said before about that male variability hypothesis, because there's an interesting phenomenon here. If you analyse the data for any NCEA subject, you'll find that girls outperform boys. They undertake more credits, they're more likely to pass, they're more likely to get excellence. Mathematics may be an exception, I think, although it's parity. It's not that boys are doing better. It's about the same in mathematics. But if you go to the New Zealand scholarship system, you find something else. So New Zealand scholarship is an optional thing that is undertaken typically in year 13, the last year of school, and students who are identified as being strong, sometimes encouraged by their schools to enter for scholarship. Sometimes they'll just undertake it off their own bats, and it's certainly the case that that's a high decile playing field overwhelmingly. There are lower decile schools that take part, and sometimes they do really well, but it's definitely biased towards the higher deciles. Partly that's resourcing, partly that's what they're gearing their efforts towards. But actually more girls than boys take part in scholarship, but boys do more scholarship subjects per head than girls. And so by the time you get to the total number of entries, it's about equal. Even though there are more girls taking part, there are roughly equal number of subject entries for boys and girls. Boys are more likely to pass scholarship exams than girls, a bit. They're quite a bit more likely to get outstanding. And when you get to the premier list, it's overwhelmingly boys.
So is there a possibility that this is because the tests are somehow biased against the girls?
That's possible, but there's no real evidence for it in that they're written in the same environment that the NCEA exams are written, where the girls are doing better than the boys.
Are they written by the same committees or similar ones?
Similar. they're not exactly the same people, but you would have people
Right.
who would write scholarship one time and an NCA exam another. And
Right.
yeah.
So it would be a bit, I guess it would be strange if you write an NCA exam and then a week later you help write a scholarship exam and you suddenly become a sexist. You
Yeah.
suddenly
So
become
I
biased
mean,
against girls.
what you're saying is possible.
Yeah.
I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem the most likely explanation to me. And this is a high-end phenomenon. This is the best students in the country in their subjects. It's awarded to 3%. So 3% of the kids studying mathematics in year 13 will get a scholarship in mathematics.
No, I mean, we have a scholarship day every year in classics where we sort of just do some extra teaching, extra prepping for the students who are taking classical subjects, and they're furiously bright. They're very good. I mean, I teach Alexander, a unit on Alexander every year, and they usually know more about Alexander's campaigns than I do. I mean, they've been specializing in that, which isn't so much my thing, but yeah, you can tell they're the top of the...
They're pretty bright.
Of the range.
Certainly, the ones who are passing scholarship calculus are far better at mathematics than I will ever be at the age of 18 or whatever they are. And when I was working at NZQA, I would attend every year the scholarship award ceremonies where the premier scholars, the best 10 in the country, or the best 10 or so students in the country would be given an award, and we'd find out a bit about them. And they were not just study nerds. Some of them had passed 8 or 9 scholarship subjects. They're in the top 3% in 9 different subjects, and frequently the very top in the country in 2 or 3 of those. And yet somehow they found time to be, in bands and do community service and play sport, and they're a phenomenal group of kids.
And what happens to those people?
A lot of them head for Oxford or Princeton or something.
Yeah. Well, the really clever one's probably Oxford rather than Princeton.
Right.
Yeah,
but that being your alumnus, right?
I'm glad that you mentioned NZQA because we're still in the introduction. We're gonna have to finish now, but soon. But but you did work for the New Zealand. Hold on, I'll get this right. See if I can get this right. The New Zealand Qualification Authority.
That's it. Yeah.
And you were the chief statistician.
Well, I was the only statistician for a lot of the time.
That's a very New Zealand thing. It's like, I'm the chief this, and you're like, well, you're the only one in the country.
Exactly. I'm one of about 3 or 4 psychometricians in New Zealand. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, well, maybe we can get through the introduction next time. But I succeeded in my dastardly plan to interview you this time. So next time, I guess you can interview me.
I'll interview you, and then
we can think of a name for what this podcast is.
We'll
have other people on.
We'll let the listeners know what the name for it will be when we've thought of it, and then I think we should interview somebody who isn't us. Yeah,
that would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
And we will touch this button, and hopefully the podcast has recorded.
Fabulous.